Hi, everybody, and welcome to this podcast of Presentation Hell. We are podcasting from Embark Studios in Tampa, Florida. Today, I'm here with Mark Carpenter, who's a master storyteller. He's not only a master storyteller, he knows how to get your story of your life so that you can retell it interesting and capture everyone's attention. He's got a book of the same title. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Great to be here with you, James.
So, right off the bat, just tell me a little bit about what is master storytelling. What is, how does that affect a lot of people? Like, we all tell stories. Tell a story.
So yeah, really, it's about taking our own experiences and turning them into compelling stories with a purpose. And the purposes that we've defined are teach, lead, sell, and inspire. So how do you use those everyday life experiences to make an impact? Whether you're leading a team, leading a family, making a sale, speaking in front of an audience, how do you use just those everyday experiences and craft them intentionally into a story with a purpose? And that purpose is to teach, lead, sell, or inspire.
So, those four components are the necessary components to tell a story.
Well, those aren't the components of the story for us. Those are the intents that you're shooting for.
Okay.
Is what's your purpose of telling the story? Because a lot of times, like you
So,
said, we
that's
all
the
tell our
first thing.
story.
That's the purpose. It's either to teach, lead, inspire. That's
Yep.
the purpose of it. So, the first thing and I'm just going to kind of try to break this down. The first thing you like to do is set out the purpose.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make as they go to tell their experience as a story, is they're just telling the experience like they're sitting around the dinner table. Well, that's just to have a conversation. But if you're presenting, if you're trying to lead, if you're trying to make a point, you need to know what that point is. And so it's taking that real life experience, identifying what's the point that I'm trying to make with this, and then crafting it intentionally into a story that'll reach that purpose.
Okay, so let's just take a point. I want my mother to be nicer to me after I haven't done the chores around the house, and I'm being called on the table. I've got a purpose, save my ass. But like, this is a real life experience. Is there structure that you add to it that you kind of, cue up the story, you set the frame, what do we want to do first? How can we help people get their butt out of trouble?
Yeah, and we've set up a fairly simple structure for people to convert their experiences into stories, and it's based on the years and years and centuries of the research around stories, including Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. But I know that in a 2 to 3 minute, maybe 4 minute story, you don't have time to go through 17 steps, and so we set it up as 3 steps. That there's a current state, goal we're trying to accomplish, who's trying to accomplish it, something that gets in the way of that goal, and then a change. So the current state, the conflict, and the change is the way that we set it up. And so that current state is, I am trying to be creative here. I am trying to create and learn and grow. And mom comes in and says, you have to stop and clean your room. And that's getting in the way of my creative activity. But if I talk to my mom and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Can you help me in this creative part of this as well as just, getting me to clean my room? If I can get some help on getting this creativity out of me, I'll clean my room more efficiently. And mom says, yeah, I think we can do that. Let's make some negotiation around that. And I was able to get my creative part done and then clean my room later and make mom happy.
Sounds like you engaged the audience and brought them in to help in that particular situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the greatest ways that we engage the audience is to tell our own experiences, because we all have these simple life experiences. I mean, you threw out the I'm in trouble with my mom for not cleaning up. How many of us have not experienced that?
Well, that's why I threw it out there. I figured what could be something that your room's a mess, clean it up. It's the last thing you
Yeah.
want to hear.
And so in the way that I framed that, and that was just off the top of my head. I could have probably done something better than that if I had a little more time to think it through. But the way that I framed that was, the point that I was making with that story is, don't just go on conflict with somebody, join somebody with your problem and say, how can we work together on accomplishing my goals as well as your goals in this situation? So you can use that simple experience to teach that lesson if you do it with intentionality. And because we've had these shared experiences, that's the connection that we make with the audience. And that's why storytelling is so powerful.
Well, that also links into one other thing. I've been told that if you don't know someone, ask a favor of them, however small, and it's a likely step you can gain friendship or trust. It might be as simple as, "Oh, can I borrow that pencil?"
Yeah.
And that's enough to engage the person and bring them in. You use this form of engagement not to convince or sell, but to bring them into the process. You engaged in what's going on as opposed to you how what am I saying? You brought them on the playing field to be a part of the solution as
And what
opposed
what I
to
hear you saying is it's all about connection. That we're making that connection. That's the word that comes to my mind when you're describing that. Is I'm connecting to these people, and that law of reciprocity that you talked about. If I bring them into my story, now it's their story too, and they
well,
can kind
isn't
of
that the art
live that
form?
experience with me.
Isn't that the art form of communication, the ability to connect?
Well,
Because you do have to inspire and you do have to connect. And to connect with someone, they need to somehow, borrowing the pencil. I was at the beach last week, and so were you. Like cut off jeans, and I saw your picture with that. I don't know. I'm bringing things up that help make it. Also, when you're telling the story, the commonality of components of the story make a difference.
yeah, right on. And I would say connection is also the art of leadership. That if you really are leading, who are we leading? When we talk about leadership, we're leading people. And
Human
so it's about
beings, yes.
making the connection with that, with the people. And storytelling is such a powerful way to do that. And you talked about making those connections by maybe identifying a commonality or asking a question. We have an entire chapter in the book about asking questions in your stories because that makes people think and again puts themselves into that story with you and connects you with them. I might, going back to your example, say, boy, I remember the day that my mom came down screaming and yelling because my room was a disaster area. If I'm telling that story, I might pause there and say, has that ever happened to you?
Well, without
Even
even
asking a
asking
simple,
that,
direct
I've
question.
already positioned it that way, the way
Yeah,
you positioned it.
yeah. And so just even simple questions within that story engages people in their brains. And there's some chemical reactions in your brain that change during stories that create that strong connection between storyteller and listener.
I wish Hollywood would listen to this a little better. I mean, it seems like there's a good story, and all they do is have to retell the story as opposed to actually creating new ones.
Yeah. Yeah. And the funny thing is, I don't think it's necessary because I agree with you. We're regurgitating kind of the same stories over and over and over again. Now, as long as they're making money off it, they'll continue to do it. But then you have some that stand out because they are different or unique stories. But what are those stories typically based on? It's the human experience.
Yes, totally.
Even if it's set in like a fantasy world, it's the human experience that connects us to those characters.
That's a very good point. Think of take two stories which are kind of very similar but very different. Harry Potter and Star Wars. You have an abandoned kid being raised by their far off uncle who is separated from some incredible experience that they're intrinsically linked to, whether it's being a wizard or being a Padawan or part of the dark side, or and they grow up only to learn who these other peoples are and to take a bigger force in it and fight good versus evil on a huge level. They're
Yeah.
both very much a similar story, but just in a different place. There's an old saying in Hollywood. I'm not a big Hollywood person, but it's give me the same story, only different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know,
And we do that all the time. And again, what makes both of those successful, even though they're the same story? In fact, you could even make the case that Star Wars Episode 4 is almost the same story as Star Wars Episode 7, the Force Awakens. That those are very much the same storyline. But why do people love that? Because they can connect to the human emotions and the characters that are in there. My wife and I sometimes will watch a movie and we'll get halfway through it and say, "This is boring. This doesn't do anything for me." And largely it's because they haven't established characters that I can relate to, and they haven't set up any kind of conflict or any kind of goal that they're trying to accomplish. So think about that. Go back to
The
your title.
challenge of the whole thing.
Yeah. So I'll go back to your title of Presentation Hell. You stand in front of a group and try to get them engaged. Well, they have to know what you care about, and they have to care about that too. So knowing your audience is critically important in that, to set up a situation that they also care about, because then they want to hear the solution because they want to be able to accomplish that solution too. Or they want to hear how you failed so that they can avoid that failure themselves.
So it sounds I'm just giving a practical feedback on this is that you can you want to articulate a human experience and to the point where you connect with the audience where they actually put themselves in that experience. I was dumped. I got fired. I won a championship. I sailed down a river without a sail. Whatever it might be. And with that, you can take any leaps you want because you're telling the story and you've already engaged them. Because they're looking for the outcome, good or bad. They had an outcome themselves. They want to know how it worked for you so that their life can be better.
Right. And they may not have had the exact same experience as you, but they probably had something similar that gives them a vicarious experience through your story. One of the things you threw out there was, I'm sailing down the river or across the lake without a sail. Well, I've never done that. I've never had that experience, but I've had times when I felt ill-equipped in a certain moment. So
Exactly.
you can make that connection to me about the time that I felt ill-equipped and show me what you did to survive that situation. That gets me thinking about, yeah, the next time I'm in a situation where I'm ill-equipped, these are some strategies I can take. And now I've learned something. And now you've inspired me and you've led me to a different action.
Oh, that's excellent. It reminds me of a book. Are you familiar with Save the Cat?
I'm not.
Okay, it's a book that writes. It's about storytelling, and it's a formula used in Hollywood, and it's very successful. But one of the key things is that the villain should save a cat early in the movie. So when the villain is doing horrible things, you have this, oh, but he saved a cat. You gave an emotional side, and it causes a connection with the audience. Oh, he's not that bad, even though he just murdered 22 people. He saved a cat.
Right. And that's the empathy. And I mentioned earlier, there's some brain chemistry that changes within us as we hear a well-told story. And one of the first things, and this is the work of Dr. Paul Zak, who's a neuroeconomist, talks about the kind of the neuroeconomy in our brains, is that when we
Neuroeconomy. Man, I'm ringing up some bills.
isn't that a great title? I love that title. But he talks about when you hear a story that has characters you can relate to, the person who saved the cat, we get an increase in our brains of oxytocin. And oxytocin is the trust hormone. And so all of a sudden we're going to trust that person more because we see them more as like us. We see them as wanting to do good things. So we can relate to those characters more because of that oxytocin increase. And so that's one of the key reasons to set up the situation in your story, in your experience, that people in your audience can relate to, because then all of a sudden they're going to trust you more as you give this information. And don't we want that as leaders and in sales? We want people to trust us, and that's one of the ways to do it.
Thank you for listening to the 60th episode of Presentation Hell. Today it's brought to you by the book Presentation Hell. It'll give you the strategies and structures to tell better stories. Well, Mark has become an expert, and he's told us a lot about techniques to use to tell better stories, to connect with your audience, to really engage in what's going on. But Mark, tell me a little bit about where you came from, where you grew up. What led you on this path to know how to tell better stories?
Well, I'll try to tell this without making your podcast really, really long, because I can go all the way back to my childhood. I grew up.
Well, tell a good story and keep your audience.
There you go. I grew up with a mother who was a reading teacher. So we always had books around the house. So books were always engaging to me in the stories that came with them. I was also one of the middle children in my family. And so this was storytelling was kind of my way to get attention from other people. As I grew up and I got to the point that I needed a
Middle of how many? Three,
five,
five,
so I was
10?
4 out of 5. I was the
Okay.
fourth of the 5 children.
Seeking attention. Holy crap.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yep. Well, and that's kind of where I was, and it came out in the form of jokes and things like that. But I always liked the jokes that were like a story. Well, you get a little older, you need something to have a career on. You can't just be telling stories to get attention. And I started my career in corporate marketing, communications, and public relations. And what is that
Where was that?
except for telling the story of your organization?
Yeah, where was that?
I started
What
I
was
started
the
with a bank in the Phoenix area, and then transitioned from there. After 10 years with the bank, I was 10 years with some software companies in the same kinds of roles. And then I made a kind of a career shift. I started teaching communications courses at a university as an adjunct professor, and really kind of fell in love with the teaching side of it. And so I got into facilitating on a corporate side. And what makes great facilitation? What makes great teaching? Storytelling. And so I use stories there.
Yeah, well, the best teachers are great
Yeah,
storytellers. Each lecture should be a story and something to connect
right
with.
on. You think back to all the memorable teachers that you had, whether it was in high school or college or wherever. They were the ones that told the great stories that you could connect to, and you remembered the principles that they were teaching around that. And so I got in the practice of telling stories a lot. Well, along about 8 years ago, I helped a friend co-author a book. Well, I didn't really co-author; I kind of ghost wrote it for him. And got to the end of that process, and I said to my wife, I feel like I got the writing bug. I want to write my own book now, but I don't know what the topic is. And she looked at me as only someone really close to you can, and says, "Oh, I know what it is." Like, what do you mean you know what it is? How can you know what it is if I don't know what it is? She said,
He's been watching you for a
That's
long
it.
time.
That's it. And so sometimes those external observers have great insights for you. So listen to those people. There's one lesson in there. She said, you need to write a book about how you take everyday experiences and turn them into great lessons. And my first response was, that's not a book. That's just what people do. And she,
That's the
yeah,
Bible.
you're right on.
That's
You're right on. Well, and any good teaching book is going to turn things into stories. That's why you have case studies, even in business books, is because that's where you'll learn from. And I thought about it more, and the point she was making was, you have somehow learned to do this fairly naturally. There's other people that it's not natural for. You need to outline
They
how to
struggle
do
with
it. Yeah, there's a lot of people who struggle with it. And so I synced up with a good friend of mine. Just the timing worked out. And so I co authored this book, Master Storytelling, with my friend Daryl Harmon. And we got into the research behind why storytelling is effective, what's an easy way to formulate that, and how do you make those everyday experiences impactful stories. So that's kind of the background of where all of that came from.
So fundamentally, your whole professional existence has come to a point of telling stories and actually connecting with people and making analogies from real experiences and how to retell that event. And these are the things that are very effective out there, and that's what your book is about, giving a foundation to someone who might not who has a lot of experiences but is struggling to kind of capsulate them to tell them to make their business better. Like if you made furniture, you might have an experience of removing a knot from a detailed piece of hardwood that turned into something beautiful, and that piece of garbage wood is really the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, and that experience is enough to communicate to a potential client that, oh, he can make that old wood look good.
Yeah. And I love that you used an analogy of woodworking. One of my sons is a great woodworker as a side job, and he has a story behind every piece of wood that he has, and so there's stories embedded in all of those things. What are our lives except for a series of little stories? That this is what we live. We love stories because we live stories. And,
Actually, the original viral issue is a
yeah,
story.
yeah.
That's everything told from generation to generation to
There you go.
generation. for my own business, Shuffler, we live by every presentation's a story and every slide's a scene.
Yeah.
And if you break down your presentations that way and you see it as a story, you see the trajectory, you see the climax, you see the conflict, you look to see if your product's the hero or is the client the hero or how is it being told? And we try to put people into a story about their business that they can, reuse throughout the whole
Yeah.
organization. And the foundations of that are really rooted in human existence and in humanity in sitting around the fire late at night and your grandparents telling a story when they were a kid that you then go out in.
I'll go back.
We call it
I'll go back farther than our grandparents. Let's go back to ancient man. What was developed first, oral language or written language? Oral.
oral and then cave
Long before,
drawings.
yeah, and then pictorially. And so this is how we kind of in our DNA communicate. This is how we
Totally.
connect. And what
Well, if we didn't do it that way, they wouldn't have on the Egyptian pyramids. They wouldn't have hieroglyphics on it. On the in Athens at the different at the Acropolis, they wouldn't have that on there. The in the mid ages, the churches that were done at that time wouldn't have made stained glass windows to tell a mostly illiterate people the story of their religion so that they can look at one scene in the quite frankly, it's not much different than your phone gleaming at you when the sun's coming through and you're like, oh, that's one story, and you move to the next and it tells another story. Ironically, we call that presentation
yeah.
management. Managing the presentation to tell stories so that stories are told better.
And I'll take that to one more point. I call it leading like a person because this is leading with humanity. Too often in leadership positions, we feel like I need to stand up and deliver the data and give a bunch of information. That's going to make me credible. That's strong leadership. That's going to inspire people. It doesn't. It's important information to share, but you need to tell the story of what that information means so that people can connect it to them and what it means to themselves. When I was getting on your Presentation Hell podcast, I was thinking about presentation hells that I've sat through. And I remember consulting with a CEO who wanted to present to a group of software engineers all the details of EBITDA in a company. Now, if you don't know what EBITDA is,
Mm-hmm.
it's earnings before interest, tax,
I know what it
depreciation,
is. Well,
amortization.
earnings before
Yeah,
taxes and interest. It's basically it measures a bit. It's a measure for the health of your
there you go.
business.
It's a financial measure of it's a measure of the financial health of your business. And I said, okay, great, but please explain to them how that relates to the work they're doing in developing software. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, these are not people that have been through finance courses. You're going to have to explain what EBITDA is to them in the first place and why it's important. But you're going to have to explain what the connection is between the numbers you're putting on that slide and their day-to-day life. And his response to me was, oh, they'll figure that out. They just need to figure that out. Now,
Yeah, that's not the you do have to make those connections. People do need to know where they sit in it and where the relationships
yeah,
are. People love a
what do
conflict.
you want to guess happened in
It,
that meeting when he just put the numbers and the charts and the graphs up there? Yeah, well, that's for the people who actually kept their eyes open. They went all glassy, but most of them didn't even have their eyes open.
I totally get it. I totally
and,
see what's going
and
on.
that's presentation hell. How do you get out of hell?
That's
You
right.
tell the story, and it's gonna bring people back out. People make decisions on emotion, and they justify those decisions on logic. And so we need to
That's
give
right.
them
Oh
the
yeah.
emotion to make the decision about the actions they're going to take to move forward. And then we can give them the logic to back it up, but they need the emotional component first so they'll take action.
We do that. That's one of the practices we put forth in our business is that your first slide should be
Yeah.
emotional. The rest of the slides need to be analytical, and however they felt on that first slide, they will use that data to reinforce whatever their belief
Yeah.
is.
When we teach our master storytelling workshop, the very first activity we do is we ask people to think of the worst presentation they ever had to sit through. And so think about the emotional reaction that people get from that. And we have them give a list of all the things that happened in this worst ever presentation. It's basically their version of presentation hell. And then we point out there's one thing that never comes up on that list. Never do we hear them say, "Oh, the worst meeting I ever sat through, somebody told these great stories." Nobody ever says that.
No, that's true. And actually, the great stories are the ones that you truly uh, engage with. You feel like you're moved. You walk away from
Yeah.
it. There's an old saying that after a show, if you put on a movie or a show and you're a director, what's the worst thing you can hear between a couple when they leave your show? What do you want for dinner,
Yeah.
honey? That's like, oh, you didn't move them. You'd rather have them, as opposed to being thrilled. You want them moved emotionally. You want them mad, angry,
Yeah.
happy, excited. You come out of Rocky, you want to beat everyone up. You're like, I can kick some butt. You know what I mean? There's real emotion being brought forth on
You know,
that. And
it's really funny that you mentioned Rocky because that just brought a memory back to me of when I saw Rocky and I was watching it with a friend of mine, and we literally ran to the car because we were so still charged up
pumped
from the
with
adrenaline
energy.
of that. And we were like, let's go. And we were running to the car. And yeah, we
You were
had
ready
that
to.
charged up feeling. That actually circles me back to something else too, that sometimes people say, well, I don't have any strong experiences that could be good stories. I just don't have a life filled with all these wonderful things. I haven't been a Rocky. I haven't been a wizard like Harry Potter. I haven't been all these things. And I always encourage them to just look for those moments in your life that you had an emotional reaction to something. Because if you had an emotional reaction to it, then there's probably a lesson there that can be learned. And if you can convey that emotion to other people, they can learn that lesson too. And you mentioned a full range of emotions: happy, sad, angry, frustrated, excited. It doesn't matter what the emotion is. If there's an emotional reaction in it, there's probably a lesson there that you could learn from that story and convey to other people because of that emotional connection that they'll get.
Well, that's a good point. So some of the core things that coming out of your storytelling, master storytelling, is a you want to set it up and engage the person through some sort of connection. B, you want to make sure that they're involved and you're considering the audience of what's going on. If you can engage them and bring them through. Three, try to get the real life commonality emotionally.
Yep.
And then with that, they will find your struggle better. And then four, they leave your meeting, your presentation, your story emotionally moved, happy, sad, frustrated, angry, ready to fight, whatever it
Yeah, and
is.
ready to take action. That's the thing that we're really trying to get to is we want to use these stories to lead people to learn new concepts, to take action on those things, and to do something different. That's the humanity and that's the connection. In addition to those things within the book and the workshop, we also give some tips on how do you deliver that? How do you deliver it effectively? Because sometimes you hear people tell a story and you go, okay, that was all right, but it was so flat in the delivery that it didn't mean anything to me. So matching up your delivery with the impact of your story as well.
So here, take a moment and tell the listeners how they can get your expertise, where it's available, and what to expect if they come in there.
Yeah, I'll give you two places to start. First is our website, which is master-storytelling.com. So you have to have the little dash between the master and storytelling. So it's right below us here. Okay. Yeah, master-storytelling.com. We actually have a free resource on there. Click on the free resources link, and there's something we call the story catcher, which helps you look for and identify what are those moments, those experiences that could be crafted into stories. So it gives you a little guideline. It's a free download that they can get there. I'd also encourage people connect with me on LinkedIn. So look for Mark Carpenter and Master Storytelling. You'll find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with people and get their questions, share my thoughts with them. I share stories out there regularly of things that have happened to me and lessons that we learned from those, that you can even borrow my stories if they help make the point that you want to make.
So I'll kind of sum it up in this way. I didn't say it, it hasn't been mentioned, but if you want to be the most interesting person in the room, learn how to tell a good story and everyone will be impressed. They'll be remember you and know that you lived an exciting life because you know how to communicate it.
That's it. That's it. You,
Sum it up.
you
Thank
want
you,
to teach,
Mark.
lead, and inspire like a real person. You want to bring people along. Learn to tell your stories. There's power in that.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for coming on today at Presentation Hell. I think everyone got some good foundational components to telling a good story. Master Storytelling with Mark Carpenter. Thank you on this 60th episode of Presentation Hell, broadcasting from Embark Studios here in Tampa, Florida. Thank you, Mark.
James, it's been great to be with you. Thanks for the conversation.